The ovarian cycle is a subcycle of the menstrual process in a female. So within the menstrual cycle, the two subcategories are the ovarian and the uterine cycle. The ovarian cycle consists of various stages that study the changes that will occur to the lining of the uterus, more specifically the endometrium, in preparation for implantation. But the ovarian cycle is more focused with the changes that occur to the follicle. But what is a follicle? If we take a look over here, this microscope view shows various developing follicles, and follicles are essentially the cluster of cells that will surround the developing ovum. And as the ovum develops, the follicle will grow and develop along with it until the ovum is ready to be released. When the ovum is released, the follicle, the outer layer, is going to be left behind, and it's going to go on to become the corpus luteum. Now, within the ovarian cycle, we have three distinct stages. We have the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. And all three of these phases are controlled by varying hormonal levels. And we're going to go over those varying hormonal levels in a second. But to quickly recap, I just want to go over the various structures within the female anatomy. So remember, we have the ovary, which is responsible for the production of gametes, in this case, the productions of our ovum. Now, once our egg is released from the follicle, it is going to be traveling within the fallopian tube, and fertilization will occur in the fallopian tube. And once it occurs, it is going to be swept by these finger-like projections called fimbriae into the uterus, where implantation will occur on the endometrium. And remember, the endometrium within the uterus is the innermost lining. The outermost lining is the perimetrium, and then we have the myometrium, which allows for the flexibility and the growth of the uterus as the zygote will develop, and the endometrium is where the blastocyst will implant. And then, of course, we have the cervix, which is that narrow opening between the uterus and the vagina, and then the vagina is the external opening to the external environment. Now, first, we are going to go over the brain, because the brain plays a key role in hormonal release and regulation of the ovulatory cycle. Now, over here, if we zoom into this section of the brain, we have the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus exists superior to our pituitary gland, and our pituitary gland is divided into two subsections, the anterior end and the posterior end. And each end of the pituitary is responsible for releasing different hormones. So the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary and tells it what to release and when. So the hypothalamus, when it releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary will then release FSH and LH. So FSH stands for follicle-stimulating hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone will tell the follicle essentially to develop, grow, nourish the ovum. So when the anterior pituitary releases that FSH, the follicle will know to grow and develop. But once the follicle receives that information from the anterior pituitary, the follicle will release inhibin. And the inhibin will go on to inhibit the hypothalamus from releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone. If the hypothalamus does not produce gonadotropin-releasing hormone, it will not be able to tell the anterior pituitary to release FSH. So essentially, once FSH is produced, the follicle receives the message and it releases inhibin to turn off the message. Basically, it says, okay, I got it. I'm growing. I'm nourishing the ovum. No need to produce more FSH. So the follicle will also release estrogen and progesterone. So as it's releasing estrogen and progesterone, so naturally estrogen and progesterone have an inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus. Both estrogen and progesterone actually inhibit the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. But there is a specific phase within the ovarian cycle in which a sudden rise in estrogen will result in a spike in luteinizing hormone LH, which is released by the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone. So if we take a look over here at this diagram, we're in the follicular phase, and the follicular phase is where the follicle is developing and maturing, and so is the ovum. Now, over here, there is a steady state of all of our hormones, and we can see that estrogen and progesterone are being released by our follicle. But then we get this rise in estrogen from our follicle, and this rise in estrogen, this specific level of estrogen, results in a sudden spike in luteinizing hormone. So this sudden spike in luteinizing hormone is what allows the ovum to be released from the follicle. So this is a really key distinction to understand over here. Estrogen and progesterone normally are inhibitory to gonadotropin releasing hormone. Remember, gonadotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus. And when it is released by the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary will release FSH and LH. So estrogen and progesterone normally inhibit GnRH, thus it inhibits FSH and LH. But in this specific case, this sudden level rise of estrogen will actually trigger, it will do the opposite, it will not be inhibitory, it will actually trigger a spike in LH. This spike in LH will result in the release of the egg, and we refer to that stage as ovulation. So previously we were in the follicular phase, and now the ovum is released and we are in ovulation. So after ovulation, we enter the luteal phase. And the luteal phase is actually aptly named because it is indicative of the corpus luteum. So remember that cluster of cells that surrounds the ovum is referred to as our follicle. But once our egg exits the follicle, we are left behind the mass of cells. And that mass of cells is now going to be referred to as our corpus luteum. And our corpus luteum produces both estrogen and progesterone. So it releases estrogen and progesterone, but interestingly, our corpus luteum is maintained by FSH and LH. And remember that estrogen and progesterone have an inhibitory effect on FSH and LH. So if our corpus luteum is producing estrogen and progesterone, but it needs to be maintained by FSH and LH, but the hormones it is releasing has an inhibitory effect on FSH and LH, the corpus luteum will eventually lead to its own demise. It will essentially promote its own death, because it's producing hormones that will inhibit the hormones that it needs for sustenance. But why does the corpus luteum produce estrogen and progesterone to begin with? That's because estrogen and progesterone are key hormones within the uterine cycle. So within the uterine cycle, we need estrogen and progesterone because they allow for the thickening and the maintenance of the endometrium. Because remember, implantation of the blastocyst must occur on the endometrium, and the endometrium must be prepped pre-hand in order for successful implantation. So the corpus luteum is releasing estrogen and progesterone in hopes of potential implantation. But as the corpus luteum releases estrogen and progesterone, the endometrium will thicken, it will mature, it'll be ready. But if implantation does not occur, the endometrium will shed off and the egg will disintegrate, and it will lead to menses, also known as the female period. But now we have to understand this other concept, which may appear complex at first, but it's quite fascinating. It's that, so the corpus luteum, it's producing that estrogen and progesterone, and it must be maintained by FSH. If implantation occurs, so essentially if fertilization occurs, remember that mature ovum, it is in the fallopian tube, and it's waiting for fertilization to occur. So if fertilization does occur, the zygote will cleave and it will divide and it'll become eventually a blastocyst. And the blastocyst will go and implant onto the endometrium. So the syncytiotrophoblasts cells of that blastocyst, once it's implanted in the endometrium, they will secrete a hormone known as human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. And human chorionic gonadotropin hormone will go on to maintain that corpus luteum. Because remember, the corpus luteum was eventually leading to its own demise because it needed FSH and LH to survive. But if implantation occurs and those syncytiotrophoblasts cells of the blastocyst secrete human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, that hormone will maintain the corpus luteum. And if the corpus luteum is maintained, it will continue to produce estrogen and progesterone, and the estrogen and progesterone will maintain the endometrium of the uterus, and it will allow for the zygote to continue to grow and develop. And that is essentially the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle consists of the follicular phase, the ovulation phase, and the luteal phase. And these phases are aptly named based on the follicle. So in the follicular phase, the follicle is developing. When we see that spike in LH, we see the release of the egg, and then we enter the luteal phase. And in the luteal phase, we have the corpus luteum releasing estrogen and progesterone, which is inhibiting FSH and LH. If implantation occurs, we see the release of human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, which will maintain the corpus luteum. But if implantation does not occur, the corpus luteum will eventually lead to its own demise, and we will enter menses, also known as the female period.